They called me a fake veteran at my cousin Rachel Walker's wedding. I was sitting near the back of the ballroom when Uncle Ron raised his champagne glass and laughed loud enough for half the room to hear. Come on, Sarah. Did you even deploy? Or did they rent you that uniform? Several guests laughed. I felt every eye turn toward me. Rachel looked away, and Ethan Carter, the groom, gave the same uncomfortable smile he'd worn all weekend. Uncle Ron's just joking, he said. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody told him he was wrong. The small metal box inside my purse pressed against my knee. Inside it was the commendation citation from an operation called Falcon Ridge, a name nobody in that ballroom should have known. Then something changed. At the head table, Colonel James Walker, Rachel's father, slowly rose from his chair. His eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from his face. He wasn't looking at a fake veteran. He was looking at someone he recognized. And in that moment, I realized the people laughing had no idea what story they had just stepped into. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was 42 years old, living quietly outside Richmond, Virginia, and trying very hard to leave certain parts of my life in the past. Most people who met me saw a reserved woman who preferred books to parties and silence to small talk. My family saw something even simpler. The difficult cousin. The military cousin. The one who never quite fit. Years earlier, I had served as Major Sarah Mitchell in the United States Army. But around family, that title rarely existed. To them, I was a government employee, a desk officer, a woman who supposedly spent her career pushing paperwork somewhere far away from danger. The truth never seemed to interest them very much. Comfort did, and comfortable stories are often easier than true ones. The strange thing was that Rachel hadn't always been that way. When we were children, we were inseparable. We spent summers at our grandparents' lake house, shared secrets, shared birthdays, shared dreams about the adults we would someday become. Back then, she never treated me like an outsider. Neither of us did. The distance came later. Slowly, almost invisibly. Around the same time, our family learned to measure success by what looked impressive at dinner parties. Lawyers, doctors, executives, people whose accomplishments could be explained in 2 sentences. Military service didn't fit neatly into those conversations, especially not the kind of service that came wrapped in silence. 3 months before the wedding, Rachel called me. Her voice sounded excited and nervous all at once. I really want you there, Sarah. I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. There was a brief pause. Then came the part she had actually called about. And maybe don't talk too much about Army stuff. I looked out the kitchen window. Army stuff, you know what I mean. Unfortunately, I did. Rachel wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to prevent discomfort. The problem was that people who fear discomfort often end up protecting the wrong things. I'll be fine, I told her. Good, she said with obvious relief. After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time. Part of me considered declining the invitation. It would have been easy. No awkward conversations. No judgment, no reminders of how little my family understood me. But Rachel wasn't just another relative. For most of my childhood, she had been the closest thing I had to a sister. That mattered, even now. So I went. Not because I expected appreciation, not because I needed approval, because sometimes love survives even when understanding doesn't. The night before, leaving for the wedding, I opened the drawer beside my bed. Inside sat a faded photograph and a small metal box. The citation inside the box carried the words, Falcon Ridge. a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. As I stared at it, a strange feeling settled over me. The feeling that something connected to that operation was about to return. And this time, it wasn't going to stay buried. The rehearsal dinner took place on a covered terrace overlooking the country club's golf course. String lights hung above us. Soft music drifted through hidden speakers. From a distance, everything looked elegant. Up close, it felt like an interview I hadn't agreed to attend. I was seated halfway down a long table between distant relatives and members of Ethan's family. Rachel sat beside Ethan near the center. At the far end sat Colonel James Walker, Rachel's father. Most of the guests treated him with a quiet respect. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody talked over him. And unlike everyone else, he spent most of the evening listening. The question started shortly after dinner was served. "So, Sarah," one of Ethan's cousins said, "Rachel told us you were in the army." I nodded. "For a while." "How long?" 20 years. A low whistle came from somewhere across the table. Before I could say anything else, Uncle Ron leaned back in his chair. 20 years, he laughed. Doing what filing paperwork, several people chuckled. I smiled politely. Something like that. That only encouraged him. "See? That's military talk for paperwork." More laughter followed. Another guest joined in. "Operations." "Right." I nodded. "Operations." He grinned. That's usually what people say when they never actually left the office. A few people laughed harder this time. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, but she stayed silent. I wasn't surprised. Then Uncle Ron raised his glass. "Come on, Sarah, be honest. How many medals do they hand out for spreadsheets?" The table erupted. Even some people who looked embarrassed couldn't help smiling. The joke was too easy, too safe. I looked toward Rachel. For a moment, I thought she might finally say something. Instead, she focused on her plate. Then Ethan spoke. "Relax, everyone." For one brief second, I thought he was about to stop it. Instead, he laughed. "This is just how families show affection." The table relaxed immediately. The message was clear. Keep going. She's not worth defending. Something inside me sank. Not because strangers were mocking me, because someone who should have known better had chosen comfort over courage. People often mistake silence for fear. The truth is that silence sometimes comes from disappointment. I looked down at my hands. The thin scar crossing my left wrist caught the light. A small thing, easy to miss, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. At the far end of the table, Colonel Walker suddenly stopped eating, his eyes fixed on the scar. Then, on my face. The room continued laughing around us, but he wasn't listening anymore. He was studying me, as if a memory had just returned. Slowly, he set down his fork. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then, quietly enough that only a few people nearby heard him, he spoke a single word. "Falcon." Every sound around me seemed to disappear, because almost nobody knew that name, and the people who did never forgot it. For several seconds after Colonel Walker spoke, I couldn't answer. The name hung between us. Falcon. One word. 20 years of memories. The laughter around the table continued, but it sounded distant now, like noise from another room, because I was no longer sitting at a rehearsal dinner. I was back in Afghanistan, back in a command tent that smelled of dust, fuel, and exhaustion. Back on the worst night of my career. Most people imagine military service as action. gunfire. Explosions, heroic moments. The reality is usually far less dramatic. Most of the important decisions happen in rooms, around maps, inside briefings, between people who know there are no perfect options. At the time, I was serving as an operations officer attached to a medical evacuation task force. I wasn't the pilot. I wasn't the commanding general. I wasn't the person physically flying into danger. My responsibility was different. I was responsible for operational assessment, extraction timing, and route recommendations. On the night of Falcon Ridge, those recommendations became the difference between acting and waiting. A reconnaissance team had entered what intelligence believed was a secure extraction zone. The intelligence was wrong. By sunset, the team was trapped. Several soldiers were wounded. A severe dust storm was moving across the region. Visibility was collapsing by the minute. The safer decision was obvious. Wait for the storm to pass. The problem was that some of the wounded might not survive long enough to see morning. I still remember standing over a folding table covered with maps and weather reports. Every person in that tent understood the risks. The pilots did. The command staff did. I did. Nobody wanted to send aircraft into a storm, but nobody wanted to leave wounded soldiers behind either. I reviewed the weather data one final time. The terrain, the extraction routes, the available flight window. Then I gave my assessment. If we waited, we might lose them. If we launched immediately, we had a chance. The final authorization came through command. But everyone in that room knew which recommendation had changed the decision. The helicopters launched shortly before darkness swallowed the valley. Then we lost contact. 11 minutes. That was all. 11 minutes without communication. 11 minutes that felt longer than entire deployments. When contact was finally restored, the aircraft were inbound, damaged, running on little visibility, carrying every member of the team. Alive. Some injured, some unconscious, but alive. The operation later received commendations. Reports were written. Records were archived. Most of the details eventually disappeared behind classification reviews and operational restrictions, which was fine with me. I had never wanted recognition. The people who came home were enough. That was always enough. I looked back at Colonel Walker. The conversation around us was beginning to fade as nearby guests noticed our expressions. Walker held my gaze. There was no doubt in his eyes now, only certainty. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. The young lieutenant on that helicopter survived. I nodded slowly. I know. Walker's expression softened. Yes, he said quietly. But what you don't know is that he's sitting in this family today. The next day, the wedding unfolded exactly the way expensive weddings are supposed to. Perfect flowers, perfect lighting, perfect smiles. The kind of carefully managed perfection that leaves very little room for uncomfortable truths. For most of the afternoon, I managed to avoid becoming the center of attention. I spoke with a few relatives, congratulated Rachel, shook hands with people I barely remembered, and stayed as far away from Uncle Ron as possible. Unfortunately, Uncle Ron had never met a room he wasn't determined to dominate. The thing about him was that he wasn't cruel in the obvious sense. He wasn't angry, he wasn't malicious. He simply loved being the funniest person in the room. And after years of nobody challenging him, he'd learned that embarrassment was often the fastest path to laughter, especially when someone else was paying the price. The reception began shortly after sunset. Dinner was served. Toasts were made. The dance floor filled. Then the slideshow started. Rachel had spent months collecting photographs from family members. Childhood birthdays, graduations, family vacations, holiday gatherings. The room laughed and applauded as memories flashed across the screen. Then my photograph appeared. I immediately recognized it. An official army portrait taken years earlier. Dress uniform. Service ribbons. A serious expression that looked younger than I remembered. The image remained on the screen longer than the others. Not dramatically longer. Just enough to feel intentional. I turned toward Rachel. Her expression told me everything. She had included the photograph herself. Not to embarrass me. Not to honor me. Simply because it was one of the few pictures she had. She didn't understand what she was displaying. That somehow made it sadder. The room grew curious. A few guests leaned forward. Then Uncle Ron saw his opportunity. "Well," he announced loudly, "there's our war hero." Several people laughed. Careful. Someone joked. She might write us all up in a spreadsheet. More laughter. Even now, the comments weren't vicious. That was what made them difficult. Every insult arrived disguised as humor. Every dismissal arrived disguised as affection. I looked toward Ethan. For one brief moment, I thought he finally understood how far things had gone. Instead, he smiled awkwardly. "Come on, Uncle Ron." The room quieted slightly. Then Ethan added the words that disappointed me most. "Let's not scare the guests." The laughter returned immediately. Louder this time. Permission granted. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Clarity. There comes a moment when you stop expecting people to become who they should have been. That moment had arrived. Across the ballroom. However, one person wasn't laughing. Colonel Walker was staring at the photograph. Not casually. Carefully. The way an investigator studies evidence. The way a soldier studies a report. Then his eyes moved from the screen to me. For several long seconds, he didn't look away. When the slideshow finally ended, applause filled the room. A moment later, I felt a hand gently touch my shoulder. I turned. Colonel Walker stood beside my table. His expression was calm, serious, certain. "Major Mitchell," he said quietly, "would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment?" I followed Colonel Walker through a side door that opened onto a stone terrace behind the ballroom. The music from the reception faded the moment the door closed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The evening air felt cool after the noise inside. Walker rested both hands on the railing overlooking the gardens. Then he looked at me. "You're Major Sarah Mitchell." It wasn't a question. I considered denying it. There was no point. "Retired now," I said. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Still Major Mitchell." For a moment, we simply stood there. Two people connected by a story neither of us had expected to find at a wedding. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the rehearsal dinner. "How do you know about Falcon Ridge?" Walker nodded as if he'd expected it. "Because I spent years trying to understand what happened to my son-in-law." I frowned. "My son-in-law, Ethan." The name landed between us. For a second, I simply stared. Walker continued. "Ethan Carter, the groom, Rachel's husband, the man who had laughed when Uncle Ron mocked me, the man who had spent 2 days treating my military service like an awkward family joke." I felt something tighten in my chest. Walker studied my reaction. "I see you didn't know." "No." I looked back toward the ballroom doors. "No, I definitely didn't." Walker exhaled slowly. "Neither did Ethan." That got my attention. What do you mean? He never knew your identity. I remained silent. Walker continued. When Falcon Ridge happened, Ethan was 24 years old. I remembered that much. Barely. A wounded lieutenant. Severe blood loss. Unconscious before extraction was complete. Walker nodded. As far as Ethan understood, he was rescued by a medevac operation. He paused. The reports he received afterward contained unit designations, operational summaries, and command references. No names, no faces. No, Major Sarah Mitchell. The operation went through classification reviews not long afterward, Walker said. Most individual identities disappeared from the versions he was allowed to access. Suddenly, the entire situation made sense. For years, Ethan had known that someone made a decision that saved his team. He simply never knew who. Walker reached inside his jacket. This time he removed a folded photocopy. The Falcon Ridge After Action Report. My name appeared near the bottom of the first page. Major Sarah Mitchell, Operations Assessment Officer. I stared at it. The same words I hadn't looked at in years. How did you get this? Ethan spent years trying to understand what happened during that mission. Walker smiled sadly. Military fathers become very good researchers when their children almost die. That was probably true. He carefully folded the document again. Then he looked directly at me. Sarah, there is something you need to know. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. What? Walker glanced toward the ballroom, toward the celebration, toward the man who still had no idea. Then he said quietly, Ethan has spent his entire adult life wishing he could thank the person who made that call. He paused. And tonight, he's going to find out that person has been sitting at his wedding all weekend. The wedding reception reached its peak shortly after 7 o'clock. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Champagne flowed, music played. Guests moved between tables sharing stories and laughter. From the outside, it looked like the perfect wedding. From where I sat, it felt like a countdown. I had returned from my conversation with Colonel Walker nearly an hour earlier. Since then, I couldn't stop looking at Ethan. Not because I was angry. Because I knew something he didn't. A truth sitting quietly in the room between us. A truth that had survived 20 years. Across the ballroom, Rachel looked happier than she had all weekend. She was dancing with friends, taking photographs, enjoying the evening she had spent months planning. Part of me hoped the night could simply end there. No revelations, no embarrassment, no public correction, just a wedding. Unfortunately, some people don't know when to stop. Uncle Ron was one of those people. The later the evening became, the louder he grew. Each drink seemed to increase his confidence. Each laugh encouraged him further. By the time speeches were announced, he was practically performing for the room. Guests expected it. Some even enjoyed it. Because for years, Uncle Ron had been rewarded for being entertaining, even when entertainment came at someone else's expense. I watched him rise from his chair holding a champagne glass. The room immediately quieted. Several guests smiled in anticipation. Rachel's expression tightened slightly. Even she seemed nervous. Ron grinned. Well, he announced, before the official speeches begin, I think we should acknowledge the real hero of the family. The room chuckled. I already knew where this was going. So let's all raise a glass to Cousin Sarah. More laughter. A few people glanced toward me. 20 years protecting America from dangerous spreadsheets. The ballroom erupted. Some guests laughed openly, others looked uncomfortable. A few stared down at their plates. Rachel looked horrified. Uncle Ron. But he continued. "Come on," he said, pointing toward me. "If she's really a war hero, let's hear a story. One deployment. One battle. One thing that proves she wasn't just sitting behind a desk the whole time." The room became uncomfortably quiet, not silent, waiting, watching, expecting. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. I could have answered. I could have ended the conversation in seconds. Instead, I remained seated, calm, still, the same way I had remained calm every other time someone decided my silence meant weakness. Across the room, Ethan shifted uneasily. For a moment, I thought he might finally stop it. Instead, he gave a nervous laugh. "Ron, maybe leave Sarah alone." The words sounded weak even as he said them. Not a defense, not a correction, just an attempt to avoid discomfort. Exactly what Rachel had been doing all weekend. Uncle Ron raised his glass again, smiling, preparing another joke. Then the microphone crackled. The sound cut through the room like a knife. Every head turned. Near the stage, the master of ceremonies looked confused, then nervous, then suddenly very respectful. Because Colonel James Walker had just stepped beside him, and for the first time all evening, Uncle Ron stopped smiling. The ballroom fell silent as Colonel James Walker stepped onto the stage. Not polite silence. Curious silence. The kind that appears when people sense something unexpected is about to happen. Walker accepted the microphone. For a few seconds, he simply looked across the room. His gaze passed over Rachel, over Ethan, over Uncle Ron, then finally stopped on me. I felt my stomach tighten. Not from fear, from certainty. This was it. Walker cleared his throat. "Before the evening continues, there is something I'd like to share." The room listened. Even Uncle Ron remained quiet. 20 years ago. Walker began. A reconnaissance team became trapped during an extraction operation in Afghanistan. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Others simply listened. A severe dust storm reduced visibility to almost nothing. Communications failed. Multiple soldiers were injured. The room grew still. Walker wasn't telling a joke. He wasn't offering a wedding toast. He was telling a story. A recommendation was made to delay extraction until conditions improved. He paused. An operations officer disagreed. Nobody moved. A different assessment was presented. A different decision was made. Walker unfolded a document. The sound of paper seemed strangely loud in the room. Because of that decision, every member of the team returned alive. A waiter stopped walking. A woman lowered her wine glass. The ballroom seemed to shrink around the words. Walker looked up. Most of the people involved never knew the name of the officer responsible. His eyes shifted toward Ethan, especially one young lieutenant. I saw confusion cross Ethan's face, then concern, then uncertainty. Walker continued. The lieutenant lost consciousness before extraction was complete. The room remained silent. When he later received mission summaries, the operational reports available to him contained unit references and command reviews. Walker lifted the report slightly. Not identities, not names, not Major Sarah Mitchell. The explanation settled over the room. Everything suddenly made sense. Walker looked directly at me. then spoke the words that changed everything. Major Sarah Mitchell. The room froze. Please stand. Slowly, I rose from my chair. The laughter that had filled the ballroom all weekend seemed impossibly far away now. A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. A photographer lowered his camera. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked at Walker anymore. They were looking at me. Walker folded the report, then delivered the final truth. The wounded lieutenant from Falcon Ridge is in this room tonight. A visible tension moved through the crowd. People turned, searching, wondering. Walker turned toward the head table, toward the groom, Ethan Carter. The color vanished from Ethan's face. He stared at Walker, then at me, then back at Walker. The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. Walker nodded once. You spent years wondering who made the recommendation that brought your team home? Ethan didn't move. You spent years wishing you could thank that person. Walker's voice softened. She's been sitting at your wedding all weekend. No one laughed. No one looked at Uncle Ron anymore. For the first time all night, he had no audience left. For several long seconds after Colonel Walker finished speaking, nobody moved. The silence spread across the ballroom, one person at a time. A conversation died near the bar. A waiter stopped beside a table. Someone slowly lowered a champagne glass. The room had finally run out of laughter. Ethan remained frozen beside Rachel. He looked like a man trying to understand two completely different realities at once. The first was the story he had believed for 20 years. The second was standing in front of him. Me. No, Ethan said quietly. His voice barely carried across the room. No, that's not possible. Walker didn't argue. He simply opened the report again. Lieutenant Ethan Carter. The room listened. Critical blood loss. Loss of consciousness prior to extraction. Emergency evacuation authorized under Falcon Ridge operational recommendation. Walker lowered the report. The recommendation was signed by Major Sarah Mitchell. Nobody looked at me now. They looked at Ethan, because suddenly he was no longer the groom. He was the man living with a truth he should have learned years ago. Ethan stared at me. I never knew. No, I said calmly. You didn't. The room remained silent. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that appears when people realize they may have judged someone unfairly. Ethan looked down at the floor. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. He slowly turned toward Uncle Ron. The movement was small, but everyone noticed. For the first time all weekend, Ethan looked ashamed of his own table, ashamed of the laughter, ashamed of the jokes, ashamed of himself. Uncle Ron immediately looked away. The man who had spent 2 days performing for an audience suddenly seemed desperate to disappear. Ethan turned back toward me. I spent years wondering who made that decision. His voice cracked. I spent years wishing I could thank them. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved, because everyone knew where this was going. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally broke something inside the room. I spent 2 days laughing at the woman who gave me the rest of my life. The words landed heavily. Rachel covered her mouth. Several guests lowered their eyes. Even people who had never made a joke looked uncomfortable now. Not because they had done something terrible, because they had watched it happen and done nothing. Colonel Walker folded the report one final time. Then he looked around the ballroom. The remarkable part isn't Falcon Ridge. His voice remained calm. The remarkable part is that Major Mitchell sat through every joke, every insult, and every false assumption this weekend. He paused, and never once used this story to make herself look important. The silence deepened, because everyone knew that was true. I could have ended the conversation at any point. I simply chose not to. People often mistake silence for surrender. The truth is that silence sometimes comes from strength. Ethan took a slow breath, then stepped forward. For the first time all weekend, there was no smile, no nervous laugh, no attempt to avoid discomfort. Only honesty. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah," I met his eyes. "I am so sorry." The ballroom remained quiet after Ethan's apology. Not because people were waiting for drama, because they were waiting for me. Waiting to see if I would be angry. Waiting to see if I would finally say everything I had held back. The truth was, I didn't want revenge. I never had. I looked at Ethan for a long moment. The confident groom from earlier was gone. Standing in his place was a man carrying the weight of a realization he couldn't undo. "I believe you're sorry," I said. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Then I continued. "But that's not what hurt." Ethan swallowed. Neither of us looked away. What hurt was how easy it was. The room listened. Nobody needed to know about Falcon Ridge. I shook my head gently. Nobody needed to know my rank. Nobody needed to know anything about my service. I paused. They just needed to treat me like I mattered. The silence that followed felt different. Softer. Sadder. Because everyone understood it. Rachel stepped forward first. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry too." I nodded. "I know." "No," she said quietly. "You don't." Her voice trembled. "For years, I kept asking you to make yourself smaller because it was easier for everyone else." The honesty in her words surprised me. "I thought I was protecting peace." She wiped her eyes. "But I was protecting comfort." I smiled sadly. There was a difference. A very important one. Rachel wrapped her arms around me. This time I hugged her back. Not because everything was fixed, because understanding had finally entered the room. A few moments later, Uncle Ron approached. For once, he had nothing clever to say. No audience, no punchline, just an older man standing in front of the consequences of his own behavior. I was wrong. That was all. No excuses, no explanations, just the truth. I appreciated that. Then Ethan stepped forward again. His eyes were red. I spent 20 years wishing I could thank the person who gave me a future. He took a breath. And I spent 2 days helping people humiliate her. The shame in his voice was real. I'll regret that for a long time. I nodded slowly, then learned from it. For the first time all evening, a small smile appeared on his face. I will. As the reception slowly returned to life, Colonel Walker approached me one final time. Without speaking, he handed me the small metal box that had fallen from my purse earlier in the evening. I opened it. Inside rested the Falcon Ridge Commendation Medal and the folded citation that had traveled with me for 2 decades. For years, I had kept the box closed, not out of pride, out of pain. Tonight felt different. Walker stood a little straighter. Then, in full view of the people nearest us, he offered a formal salute. I returned it, not because I needed recognition, because respect given honestly should be honored. When the evening finally ended, I walked out beneath the Virginia night sky carrying the same metal box I had arrived with. The difference was that I was no longer carrying the silence alone. People often mistake silence for weakness. What they forget is that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs enough room to arrive. And finally, it had. One of the most important lessons life teaches us is that not everyone will recognize your value when they should. Some people will judge you based on assumptions, appearances, or the version of you that is easiest for them to understand. But your worth is not determined by their opinion. Real strength is continuing to walk with dignity, even when no one is applauding, defending, or understanding you. The truth may take time to surface, but character reveals itself in how we carry ourselves while we wait. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated or misunderstood? We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoy stories about courage, honor, resilience, and quiet justice, please subscribe to the channel and join our community for more inspiring stories every week.